Episode 1. I Don't Want You to Be Happy. It was 10 p.m., and the moonlight was dazzling. Room 101 on the top floor of Hotel Waverick, Seattle was pitch black, and there was the faint sound of breathing. Natalie Davidson opened her eyes, but the world before her was so muddled that she couldn't see clearly. Her body felt strange, as if it had caught fire and she was burning alive. Someone seemed to be lying on top of her, pressing down. But no matter how much she struggled to push him away, he remained motionless. Her mind was a mess, and she couldn't think straight. She only vaguely remembered that the previous night she had welcomed her fiancé back from his travels abroad, and then because she was so happy and drunk, she had been brought to her stepsister's room to rest. She hadn't expected to find this when she woke up. "Who are you?" Natalie's voice was cut off by a heavy gasp from the man, and his grip on her body got tighter and tighter. She didn't have the strength to push him away. "Let me go." She had never felt like this before. A wave of lust washed over her, and she could not help but respond to him. Her body was exceptionally hot, and she frowned. Something wasn't right. The feeling of lust faded, and she suddenly felt terrified. But she couldn't stop the man. As he pushed into her, she felt herself losing consciousness until finally she couldn't stay awake any longer and passed out. Outside, the sky was dark. Around 3 a.m, the cell phone on the bedside table vibrated violently. With a frown, the man woke up from his sleep. His gaze slid across the messy bed sheets and then over to Natalie, who was covered only by a thin blanket. His expression immediately darkened. He picked up the phone and slammed it down. The hostility in his eyes was clear. These people had actually dared to drug him. They must have gotten tired of living. Steadily, he got up, threw back the covers, and went to take a shower in the bathroom. Afterward, without a trace of hesitation, he turned and left the room, as if the person on the bed was just an object he didn't need to pay attention to. When Natalie woke up, it was morning. The moment she opened her eyes, she felt pain. She had a splitting headache, and her entire body was extremely sore, as if it had been beaten. She sat motionless at the head of the bed. The events of the previous night flashed through her mind like a movie, making her tremble with despair. The man who had assaulted her was obviously not her fiancé, Nick. How could she have lost her virginity under such strange circumstances? What should she do? What on earth should she do? She hurriedly picked up her clothes from the floor and put them on. She wanted to go home quickly and wash up. She couldn't bear to stay in this room, even for a second longer. But the moment she opened the door, she saw Nick, who was standing outside with a shocked face, alongside her stepsister, Cheryl, and her father, Tom, who both looked furious. "Nick?" Natalie didn't know how to explain, and barely got a grip on her thoughts before she was slapped in the face by her father. The mess in the room had not been cleaned up, and the evidence of what had happened there was obvious.
"Look at what you've done. You've cheated on your fiancé. You've embarrassed me. You've embarrassed the whole family. How could I have raised a daughter like you?"
Nick gripped Tom's hand tightly and frowned as he looked at her face.
"Natalie, how could you do this?"
No. She shook her head with all her might, trying to clasp his hand, afraid that he would leave. "I was drunk last night. I only came back to the room to rest." She suddenly looked at Cheryl, who was standing in front of her with wide eyes. "You did this, didn't you? You are the one who brought me back to the hotel last night, to this room. Why did you do this to me?" When Cheryl heard this, she looked wrong. "I don't understand what you're saying. I did no such thing." "You didn't?" Natalie growled as her anger reached its peak. "Then how did I end up in someone else's room? Why would that man..." "Enough!" Nick interrupted her with a loud shout, as if he didn't want to hear anymore.
"You want to blame someone else for what you've done?"
He looked at her coldly.
"I only left for 6 months, and you're already this desperate. Did you really have to climb into someone else's bed?"
Natalie hugged her arm in panic as tears rolled down her cheeks and dripped onto the carpet. She couldn't believe Nick was saying these things. They had been together for 3 years and were about to get married. "Nick," she said in a low voice, practically begging as she looked at the resolute man in front of her. "Please, believe me." "Don't say any more. Just listening to you disgusts me." With a look of pure disdain, he turned around and strode off down the corridor. "The engagement's off. I don't want to see you again." His words were like a sharp knife stabbing straight into her heart. Despair slowly spread through her and was on the verge of spilling out. It was so painful that she could no longer breathe. "Nick!" She staggered after him, but her father grabbed her by the arm and shoved her to the floor. "Natalie, you're no longer a part of this family. From this day on, you're not my daughter." She was stunned. After they left, her head was in shambles. She didn't even know how she made it home. But by the time she did, her belongings were already packed and left by the door. Tom had even booked a plane ticket for her, and he told her to pick up her stuff and leave the country immediately. "Natalie, are you all right?" She was in a daze as she lowered her head to pick up her things. Cheryl walked down the steps at a leisurely pace. When Natalie ignored her, she didn't get angry. Instead, she laughed. "Do you really want to know how you ended up in that room? Let me tell you. You were right. I put you there. I did it because I want to marry Nick. And I can't stand the thought of you being happy with him." Episode 2. Exile. Natalie raised her head and bit her lip. She was so angry that she couldn't utter a single word. Her whole body was trembling with fury. She couldn't understand why Cheryl would ruin her life like this. Cheryl smiled. "So what if you're angry?" Cheryl played with her curly hair and sneered. "Nick doesn't believe you. Your father doesn't believe you either. You can go abroad and live on your own." Natalie was furious. "Why are you doing this to me? Why are you ruining my life? Why?" She rushed forward hysterically and wrapped her hands around Cheryl's neck. But Cheryl didn't resist. She only blinked pitifully at her. "Sister, don't hurt me. Last night really wasn't my fault." "What are you doing?" Hearing the commotion, Tom rushed out, looking so angry that the veins on his neck stood out. He raised his hand and pushed Natalie to the ground. "Are you crazy? Are you trying to kill your sister?" Natalie fell to the ice-cold sidewalk where she remained. Unable to bear the pain any longer, she was on the verge of tears. She thought of her mother and her childhood. But no matter how hard she wished, she could never return to that time. Rosemary, her stepmother, came up behind her. When she saw the marks on her daughter's neck, she was so angry, just like her husband, that she raised her hand and slapped Natalie. "You uneducated brat! You're just the same as your mother. You might as well die." The more she slapped, the harder each slap became. Tom stood beside her, but he only seemed to be concerned about Cheryl's injuries. As the attack went on, Natalie's vision grew blurry from the blows, but all she could feel was the coldness in her heart, as if all warmth had left it. At that time, in his office at the Claire Group, Bryce was looking at his assistant with a malicious expression. "What's going on?" His voice was so gloomy that his gaze could bore holes through a person. "How is the investigation going?" His assistant was sweating under his gaze, but he swallowed and told him the news. "It's Evan Wilson." Bryce knew of Evan. A while ago, he had worked with the Claire Group on a project and had taken many kickbacks from it. Bryce didn't like his way of handling things, so he had sent his men to destroy the Wilson family. Right now, the Wilsons were on the verge of bankruptcy and collapse. "Evan bribed the hotel's waiter and drugged you. He probably wanted to use this too." The assistant's voice trailed off until he was no longer breathing. The situation was clear now. Evan was behind all of this. Bryce had never thought that something would go wrong and that he would have to completely deviate from his original plan. I checked. Evan booked a room in the hotel last night. The assistant looked up at him hesitantly, then looked down again. But you didn't use it. Bryce's expression suddenly changed, and he asked in a low voice, "What do you mean?" The assistant was confused. He could only look at his face and repeat hesitantly, "You didn't use the room yesterday." If he didn't go into his room, then who was the woman who had been lying on his bed? In his mind, he saw broken images of her flushed cheeks and her body writhing beneath him. But what he remembered clearest were those cries of grief and heartbreaking pain. He suddenly remembered the crimson spots on the sheets that he had noticed before he left. The woman had been a virgin. Bryce's brows knit together. He told his assistant in a deep voice, "Go check the identity of the woman who was in my room immediately." He wanted to know where she had come from. The assistant immediately hurried off to do as he had been told. But no matter how fast he moved, he wouldn't be able to find any useful information. The hotel's surveillance tapes had already been wiped by Cheryl. How could she possibly leave behind evidence that would show that she had set Natalie up? Naturally, she had to cover her tracks. After doing this, she continued to pretend that she was innocent and gloated as she watched Natalie get kicked out of her house in a sorry state. Natalie didn't even stay a night before she was packed off and sent out of the country. She lugged her heavy luggage onto the plane. She had been exiled without knowing when she could return. Episode 3. You're My Daddy. 5 years later, Natalie stood in the first-class lounge at Heathrow Airport, staring at the 2 tickets in her hands, unable to focus. She had been in England for 5 years, and in all that time, she hadn't made even one phone call to her family. Her father treated her like she was dead, and as if he couldn't care less about it. If it wasn't for Cheryl and Nick's engagement, he might not even have remembered she existed. Her heart had no attachment to the place she had been separated from for years. All her feelings had been erased on the day she was thrown out. She didn't want to go back and see the people who had hurt her, but she couldn't stand listening to her father's threats on the phone. If she did not do what he said, he would not let her grandmother live peacefully. He could even hurt her. Her grandmother was the closest person in the world to her. She had wanted to bring her to England to spend the rest of her life there, but she couldn't sway the old lady from her desire to be in the country where her husband and daughter had lived. Natalie had no choice but to leave her where she was. If it wasn't for her grandmother, she probably wouldn't go back for the rest of her life. But she couldn't afford to lose her to her father's anger. "Mommy? Mommy!" Lost in her thoughts, she suddenly heard a lovely, gentle voice beside her. She looked down and saw a 4-year-old boy lightly tugging at the corner of her jumper. He told her in a serious voice, "Stop daydreaming. The plane is about to take off." Only then did she recover her wits. The anger in her eyes gradually softened as she smiled and picked up the child. "All right then, let's go to the gate." At the same time, on the other side of the first-class lounge, a tall man in a suit with 2 burly bodyguards standing behind him strode towards the gate with a cold expression. Natalie had bought first-class tickets. In the past few years, she had suffered a lot from feeling rootless in a foreign country, and she had developed many issues. She had bad insomnia and headaches, and she was afraid of loud noises. The moment she got on the plane, she covered her eyes with a blanket to try to fall asleep. But first, she told Liam to be good and not run around. Liam was her most precious treasure. He was very well behaved. He sat on his seat as he was told and played with the toys she had bought him, occasionally stealing glances at her. Natalie put her head against the window. He soon noticed that she did not look well. "Mommy?" He leaned across and looked at her. Seeing that she was frowning, he asked worriedly, "Are you not feeling well?" Natalie coughed twice due to an itch in her throat. With a hint of weakness in her voice, she answered, "I'm fine." She looked at the child and forced a smile. "I'm just a little thirsty." Without waiting for her to say anything, Liam jumped out of his seat and hurried off excitedly to get her some water. She didn't know who he took after. He was only 4 years old, but he was as sensible as a small adult, and he could even take care of her. Liam came running back with a glass of water. As he reached their seats, he bumped into a man who had just stepped into the plane. The glass in his hand wobbled, and the water spilled from it, wetting the man's shoes and the legs of his pants. Bryce lowered his head and looked at the water stains on his clothes. He frowned in displeasure.
"What are you doing? Don't you know to watch where you're going?"
"I'm sorry." Liam held the cup and apologized repeatedly, but when he raised his head and looked at the man, he was immediately stunned. Liam had once finally mustered the courage to ask his mother about his father. Natalie was taken aback and stood speechless for a moment before she randomly showed the young boy a picture of a handsome man and told him that this was him. Looking at Bryce, Liam instantly somehow recalled the same picture and realized that the two men resembled each other to almost a fault. Bryce was a well-built man who possessed a muscular demeanor and suave gait. His pose and grace made the young boy quiver. The more he looked at Bryce, the more he felt that the man in front of him fit his image of his father from the picture. He stood quiet for 2 seconds before hurling himself at Bryce's long legs and then shouted, "Daddy!" The two bodyguards behind Bryce were completely taken aback by the scene unfolding in front of them. They had been with Bryce for a long time, but this was the first time they'd seen someone act so affectionately with him, let alone someone so young. Bryce's expression instantly turned ugly. He reached out his hand to push away the little arms that wrapped around him and said coldly, "Don't randomly call people your father. I'm not your father." He had known many women who had claimed to be pregnant with his child, but this was the first time he had ever seen such a clever and affectionate son. Liam stared at his face and answered with certainty, "You are my daddy. Why did you abandon me and Mommy?" The more he spoke, the more wronged he felt. He pouted his small mouth and put on a pitiful expression. When the passengers beside them heard this, they immediately looked over in curiosity. Natalie couldn't sleep through the commotion. She opened her eyes and looked in the direction of the noise, only to find her son standing in the middle of the aisle, holding onto the leg of an unfamiliar man. Sorry. She quickly got up. Embarrassed, she reached out to take the child's hand. He must have made a mistake. Liam let go of him. Her son had always been sensible and listened to her over anyone else, but today she didn't know what was going on. No matter how much she tried to persuade him, Liam continued to hold on to the leg of that strange man's pants. He bit his lips in frustration and refused to let go. Bryce was a cold person, but when he looked at the child's pitiful expression, he felt a bit moved. He frowned and said to Natalie, "Why did you become a mother? If you couldn't give him a complete family, it would have been better not to have him at all." Episode 4, You Make Me Sick. The man's words stuck like a fishbone in her throat, mercilessly and viciously piercing Natalie's sorest spot. What had happened on that unfaithful night was not her fault, and she had only found out that she was pregnant after she went abroad. She didn't even know the man from that night who had done this to her, much less what she should do. After a long period of indecision, she had finally mustered up the courage to have the child. She had never regretted it, and she did not feel that someone she had never met could blame her for it. "Sorry, but that's none of your business." Her expression immediately turned cold, and she enunciated every word very clearly. "He just accidentally spilled water on you and mistook you for someone else. You don't have the right to speak to me like that." She stared at the man in front of her with a fiery gaze and added, "I can teach my own child. I don't need you to give him a lesson." "You can teach your child," Bryce scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Since he has a mother like you, I'm afraid he'll end up spoiled." Natalie clenched her fists and tightly pursed her lips. She took the cup of water out of Liam's hands and threw it in the man's face. The water slid down his skin. Seeing his shocked expression, she smiled coldly. "Well then, I really must thank you for your concern." She ignored the fuming man, picked up her child, and returned to her seat. After what had just happened, Liam was in a low mood. Natalie's heart ached to see him like this. She'd never seen him look for his father before, didn't know what had possessed him to hug a stranger's leg and call him daddy. "Liam, what happened to you just now?" She reached out and gently ruffled the hair on his forehead. "Why did you call him daddy?" she asked softly. Liam looked up and blinked at her. "He is my father. I know it. I can feel it," he insisted. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He could feel that man was his father. "All right, you." She poked his forehead and said seriously, "Don't mess around anymore. Do you hear me?" Fortunately, the rest of the flight was uneventful, and she did not see that man again. As she led Liam out of the airport, she bumped into Cheryl and Nick, who had come to pick her up. 5 years had passed, but she still hadn't expected to see her stepsister again so soon. "Long time no see." Cheryl held Nick's hand and smiled, leaning on his shoulder. "I really missed you." Natalie thought that she no longer felt anything for them, but after seeing this, the hatred in her heart skyrocketed. "Is that so?" she replied coldly. Looking at Cheryl's smug expression, she felt disgusted. Liam, who had been sitting on his luggage, looked out curiously from behind Natalie's legs. He saw Cheryl and Nick and asked, "Who are they?" Cheryl was shocked when she saw the child. She had been so focused on flaunting her feelings in front of Natalie that she hadn't noticed him. Before she could finish, Natalie replied calmly, "This is my son, Liam." "Son? How did she get a son?" Cheryl had countless questions in her mind. She hadn't even heard that Natalie was married, so where had he come from? "Big sis, you're so mean." She nudged Natalie and said with a smile, "You didn't even tell us you got married?" 5 years before, Cheryl had pretended to be innocent and wronged so that she could play the victim. Now she was affectionately calling her Big Sis, as if they had a deep sisterly affection for each other. She was really a talented actress. Natalie watched her performance, and the disgust in her heart almost reached its limit. Since it's come to this, what's the point in pretending? How can you look at yourself and not feel sick? You make me sick. The moment she finished speaking, Nick, who had been standing beside his fiancée without saying anything, shouted angrily, "Why do you bother with her, Cheryl? She did so many shameless things in the past. This child might even be the illegitimate son of that man." Episode 5. Pick on someone your own size. Natalie's calm expression turned cold when she heard the word illegitimate. She stared at Nick and asked in a deep voice, "Who are you calling an illegitimate?" He burst into laughter, and his voice rose a few notches. He pointed at Liam and said, "I said he's illegitimate. Can't you hear me?" Before he could finish, Natalie slapped him viciously across the face. She almost couldn't believe that this man standing in front of her, calling her son illegitimate, was the same person she had loved back then. After 5 years, she had discovered that their relationship was only worth this much. How could he be so cruel to a child, never mind her? The slap was loud and clear. Nick was stunned. He covered his face with his hands, still in a daze. Cheryl, who was standing beside him, could no longer suppress her anger, and she shouted, "Hey, how could you hit him?" Nick was her fiancé now. By hitting him, it was as if Natalie had hit her too. Cheryl's face became so hot it turned red. But no matter how angry she got, Natalie remained unmoved. She simply turned her head and looked at her coldly, saying, "If you keep talking nonsense, I'll hit you too." Nick was a man with an awful temper. When he heard Natalie's words, he became even more furious. "Do you really think I won't hurt you?" He took a step forward, clenching his fist. But before he could make a move, Liam jumped down from his luggage and ran towards his mother to block the blow with his hand.
"You nasty people! Don't bully my mommy! Stop it!"
As he said this, he tried to push Nick away, but he was too small and could not move him at all. His face flushed as he tried his best to protect her, and Natalie's heart softened. "Idiots!" Nick was already furious, but now his rage increased. He reached for Liam's arm to push him out of the way, but before he could grab him, a tall figure got out of a car, walked up to them, and pulled the child into his arms. "My little boy." Bryce's voice was icy. "When did you become so big to teach these guys a lesson?" He had seen what was happening. Seeing the woman who had spoken to him so righteously on the plane being mocked by these two had made him unhappy. And when he had seen Nick raise his hand as if he was about to strike the boy, Bryce could not stop himself as he opened the door of his car and got out. Natalie turned her head in surprise. She hadn't expected the man who had been so rude to her on the plane to actually help her.
"Daddy!"
When Liam saw Bryce, he hugged his leg excitedly and said,
"Daddy, these two bad people are being mean."
When he said Daddy, both Nick and Cheryl froze. They had thought Liam was illegitimate, the son of Natalie and that other man. They hadn't expected her to actually find a man abroad, let alone one who looked rich and important. The two of them looked at each other and were suddenly at a loss for words. Bryce turned around and glanced at Natalie. He said in a deep voice, "Didn't I tell you to wait outside? How did you end up in this situation so quickly?" She was stunned for a moment. She didn't know why he was helping her, but she took his cue and grabbed his arm. Who knew that we would encounter such a crazy couple right outside the terminal? Forget them, darling. Let's go. He nodded, but when they turned around, he glanced back at Nick, who was standing blankly to one side, and said harshly, "Remember, before you try to teach someone else a lesson, you should take a good look in the mirror and see if you have the right to." Nick was scared witless by the man's merciless gaze. He gritted his teeth as he watched Natalie grab the man's arm and get into his car. It was too much for him to bear. Cheryl stood at his side, her face filled with undisguised jealousy as she looked at the man's Cadillac. She was extremely angry. That was a limited edition car. It was not something that just anyone could buy. How had Natalie gotten involved with such a man? Episode 6, $100. The car drove out of the airport. After a while, Bryce looked at Natalie and said indifferently, "You can let go." Only then did she come to her senses. She immediately let go of his hand and fiddled with the hair beside her ear awkwardly. Thank you for helping us." Liam, who was sitting next to her, shouted excitedly,
"Thank you, Daddy!"
"Don't shout." Natalie reached out to cover the child's mouth and shushed him. "You can't just call someone Daddy."
"Why?"
Liam blinked and looked at her in confusion.
"Daddy helped us just now. He stopped those mean people from bullying us."
Natalie was stunned. She didn't know why he believed this man was his father, nor did she know how to explain Bryce's actions. She coughed lightly, looked at Liam, then lowered her head and said in a soft voice, "This man is not your daddy. He just saw us being bullied by bad people. That's why he stepped in to help us." She reached out her hand and gently tapped the child's nose as she laughed. "You can't do this anymore. Do you understand?" Bryce stared out of the window with a cold expression. He seemed to be deep in thought until he heard Natalie's words. Then he said sharply, "I pitied your child, so I helped you. Don't take my kindness as a charity that you can ask for any time." He turned his head to look her up and down, then folded his arms and turned away again. And I won't take responsibility for the actions of a woman like you. Obviously, he had heard what Nick had said about Liam being illegitimate. These words stabbed Natalie's sore spot and her expression hardened. She had been grateful to him for saving her, but now it seemed there was no difference between him and Nick. They both saw her as nothing more than a speck of dirt. Stop the car. She didn't want to say anything else, so she signaled the driver to stop with an expressionless face. Bryce looked at her in confusion. When the car stopped, she got out and reached back in to pull Liam out. "What are you doing?" he asked. She removed her luggage, took $100 from her wallet, and threw it on the car seat. "Thank you for your help. This is the cab fare. I hope we never meet again." She took Liam's hand, pulled the suitcase, and strode off, not giving Bryce any time to react. He looked at the $100 bill she had thrown at him and squinted his eyes dangerously. When was the last time a woman had spoken to him so bluntly? Usually, women didn't dare to get angry with him, not even when he was being rude to them. He gritted his teeth and threw the bill out the window. Then he gestured to the driver. "Drive." Natalie didn't go straight to the family home after getting out of Bryce's car. Instead, she took a cab to her grandma's house. After all these years, Grandma's courtyard was still the same as it had ever been, but the old woman had aged quite a bit. Natalie quickly stepped forward to hug her. Her heart warmed and her eyes filled with tears. "Grandma, I missed you so much." "Natalie, my sweet granddaughter." The old lady gently patted her back and said with a calm, gentle laugh, "I was wondering how much suffering you've endured while you were away." Naturally, she was overjoyed to see her precious granddaughter and delighted to meet Liam. She doted on him, wishing that she could keep him locked up in her heart. Having experienced so many things in her own life, she knew what to ask and what not to ask. And since her granddaughter didn't seem to want to talk about it, she didn't ask about the child. Natalie stayed at her grandma's for the night. The next morning, she took Liam out for a stroll. She thought about the places she used to go to when she was young and couldn't help feeling a little happy. But she didn't expect to run into Nick and Cheryl at the entrance of the residential complex. They had come looking for her. The smile on her face immediately disappeared and she stared at them. "I don't think we have anything else to say to each other. Please don't bother me." Cheryl hadn't come here on her own initiative. She deeply hated Natalie and didn't want to see her. So why would she come looking for her? "Do you think I wanted to come here?" She twisted her lips. "Daddy wants to see you. He wants you to come home." Hearing these words, Natalie fell silent. She didn't want to have anything to do with her family anymore, but she still hadn't made this clear, so she needed to talk to him face to face. She stood there quietly for a long time before she took Liam and put him into their car. On the way, no one said a word. The car soon arrived at the family home. Looking through the window, she saw that the yard was pretty much the same as it had been when she left, but the situation was different now. She could no longer face these people with a calm demeanor as she had before. "You're back." As soon as she stepped into the house with Liam, her stepmother Rosemary came hurrying over. She put on a warm and gentle expression and said, "You must be tired from traveling. Was the flight okay? Are you hungry? Mary, please prepare some food for Natalie," she said to the house cook. Natalie watched her fake sincerity and felt extremely disgusted. Rosemary had ignored her for the past 5 years and had never cared about her in the least. But now she was showing all this enthusiasm. "I know you don't like me." She gave her an unappreciative look. "You don't have to do this." "What did you say to your mother?" Tom's sullen voice came from the living room. When he came out and looked at the child in Natalie's arms, he frowned. "I sent you out of the country to reflect on your behavior, but instead you brought back a bastard." His entire body filled with anger, and his finger trembled as he pointed at Liam. "Let me tell you, I will not accept him as part of the Davidson family."